All right. Thank you, everybody, for just waiting for us. We have little complications, unexpected things that you don't see coming. But thank the Lord, we are here. We're live with Dr. Tremper Longman, ready to go. So I'm gonna I'm going to introduce him a little bit now, Dr. Lemon. Let me know. Let me tell you how do I get to know about you. Um, I study under the late Michael Heiser, and you endorsed his book back in the day, and he had you on his podcast a couple of times, ETS, and from that moment I got hooked with your scholarship. So I understand that by if we're going to talk about Genesis, we need to talk with Dr. Tremper because that's within his expertise, his area of research. He has written a lot of books, which is good, and we just want to go ahead and touch on this topic with the help of Dr. Lemon. And once again, Dr. Longman, I just want to appreciate and value your time and thank you so much for being here with us in our audience. And remember, this is the main purpose of this interview is to take this material, like we were doing with the others, and bring it to for those who have a keen interest in learning about you guys, the scholars, but for some reason, such as the language, they can't. So we want to bring it to translate it into our own language, which is Spanish, so that they can listen to this or watch this video and they can learn a little bit more about from you. So that's the main purpose about this of this interview. So once again, thank you. And with that in mind, let me hit the intro right now. So, welcome back, everybody, to your Bereano 1711 podcast, where we talk about religion because it's important, but we critically analyze it because that's even more important. Today, with us, we have a special guest, Dr. Tremper Longman, to talk about a very important topic on the first book of the Bible, which is Genesis. Dr. Longman, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Marv. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
No, thank you for being here with us and, taking a bit of your time, your agenda, your schedule to talk about this important subject because Genesis has been the center of much controversial, debate over the years. Scholars still they go hand in hand, writing stuff, arguing about what this book is all about, history, myth, fiction. What are those stories? And you have read about it, and we just want to take advantage of your scholarship and your training on this stuff. So, without much further ado, we want to go in and jump into the questions of the interview right now. Dr. Lemon, can you just give us a little bit of background how you starting in all this, the world, the biblical studies? How you went to jail? That's my understanding. How was all of that about? How it started? Please give us a little bit of background on that.
I didn't go to jail, but
Oh, my bad, my bad.
all right, that's
What
all
I
right.
was reading.
Not that
Thank you for that
you,
correction.
you'll have to send me what you were reading.
Yeah,
No,
I will take that a note on that. But go
but
ahead, tell us a bit of your credentials.
oh yeah, sure,
Your
sure.
career. Thank
Oh,
you.
to Yale. I'm sorry. I did go to Yale, not
Oh,
jail.
Oh, okay. There you go. Thank you. So I was okay.
Glad I got. Some people think I may have gone to prison.
Oh, no, not at all. Let's take
Okay,
that away.
let me. So I became a Christian
Yeah,
just before college, and I'm 72 years old. So we're talking
yeah,
about something over 50 years ago. So I became a
yeah.
Christian during the
It's been a
Jesus
while.
Revolution of the 70s. But I soon came under the influence of people like R.C. Sproul, who would come to our
Yeah,
campus and talk. This is before R.C. Sproul became as famous as he became before his death. And then I met my future wife in college, and she had
yeah,
become a Christian recently through a bunch of students at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. So I went to Westminster Seminary, and I was thinking that I'd want to go into academics, into scholarship, but I didn't know what area. Because back then in the 70s, it's different from today.
yeah,
Now we have a lot of different Bible translations to choose from. Back then we didn't. Back then there are a lot of commentary. Now there are a lot of commentaries. Back then there weren't. So I wanted to be somebody who would contribute in those areas. So I came under the influence of a young, exciting, brilliant Old Testament professor called Ray Dillard. And
yeah,
he took me under his wing and encouraged me to go on. When I did go to Yale and do my doctorate, and then Ray hired me after he got back. And Ray is probably best known for his Second Chronicles commentary in the Word Commentary series, and also co-authoring with me the introduction of the Old Testament, but which has been translated into Spanish. But
good.
he but then he died. He died at the age of 49. But in any case, he encouraged me to go off to Yale. I did my doctorate
Yeah,
there, and then I taught at Westminster for about 18 years before I decided to move to Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. But I was attracted to the Old Testament for some practical and some scholarly reasons.
yeah,
Scholarly one was the Old Testament was very intriguing to me. It was a much more foreign world. I like studying ancient languages.
yeah,
Um, the practical one was at Westminster in the class that was getting their MDiv before me. Everybody was going into New Testament, whether it was Andrew Lincoln or Wayne Grudem, who actually went into New Testament first, or Vern
yeah.
Poythress, or there were a whole bunch of people. I said, I need a job. I'm going to go into Old Testament stuff.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah, right. I'm glad I did. I'm glad I did.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. You wrote an introduction to Old Testament with Ray, right?
Yeah, right.
And if I'm not mistaken, uh, that was that was also translated into Spanish. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you're right. It is. It
Yeah.
is. It
Yeah.
translated. Yeah.
So yeah, as I was saying off camera, I got to know Dr. Longman's scholarship because of my mentor, the late Michael Heiser. He endorsed his book, The Unseen Realm, and I think that was the goal. And I'm saying this because we are on the eve. He passed away on February the 20th, back in 2023. So I'm saying this kind of as a tribute to him because he introduced not only me, myself, but many people around the world into the wild the wild world of biblical studies. And once you're there, you get to know a lot of awesome people, just like Dr. Longman and their scholarship. And in my case, um, it's been my dream to talk with these guys because they are the experts. They are the people who are putting a lot of effort and work and resources and writing a lot. I was talking with I don't know if I'm pretty sure you know him, uh, or at least you have heard about him, Crispin Fletcher Louis from UK. And I was interviewing about his book, The Divine Heart, which is almost 1,000 pages book. And I was saying to him, I I I can just I mean, I really appreciate your work, because when I was in college, if I were to write a 5 pages essay, Dr. Lemon, I would feel like, oh my goodness, it's eternity, and I wanted to finish as soon as possible. And you guys go on to write your book on the story of God series. You wrote the book of Genesis, and it's
Right.
almost 70, 100 pages. I mean, you guys have a gift for this stuff. And writing a book, it takes, my goodness, a lot of time and effort and dedication and everything. So I just take a lot of I give a lot of appreciation for that. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to to reach out to Dr. Lemon and others, to bring and give this platform for you guys, but also following Heiser's mission to to go beyond our frontiers. Uh, English is probably, I'm pretty sure, is the lingua franca nowadays, but still we got people who can't speak or read in English, but they want to know about this.
Mm.
And I was saying to myself, how is possible that I am already enjoying about the benefits of this, but there is a lot of people out there who would like to know about Dr. Lemon and their scholarship and many others. We need to do, and we have to do something about it. And that's why we're doing this interviews. And we just can't get enough of you guys. So thank you about that. So, Dr. Lemon, let's jump into the questions, because we want to value your time, and we can go from there. So I don't know if you're ready for the first questions for this interview.
I'm ready. I'm ready. Mark.
Excellent. Let's do it. So we got the first questions here for Dr. Tremper Lemon, and it goes like this: what are the theological and literary implications of reading Genesis in its ancient Near East context?
Good question. And
Yeah.
I'll start, though, maybe with a historical comment, which is my friend John Walton, whom I'm sure you know.
Oh yeah.
John is fond and right to say the books of the Bible were not written to us.
To us, yeah.
They were written for us, but not
For
to
us.
us.
Yeah.
So it's just reminding
It's a
us
difference.
that every book of the Old and New Testament were written to their contemporaries in a language, Hebrew in the Old Testament, a little bit of Aramaic, and using literary forms and referring to cultural customs that they were familiar with, that we're not necessarily familiar with. So as they are communicating to their contemporaries, they are writing in a way that's familiar to them, and as a result, it often takes more work for us to ask, well, what did it mean, say, in Genesis 15, when God, in the form of a flaming torch and a smoking fire pot, went between the divided halves? Or what does Abraham mean in Genesis Genesis 15, when he says, since you haven't given me an heir, Eleazar, son of Damascus, will be my heir? I mean, the answer to those questions are found in ancient Near Eastern customs. And then when you come to Genesis 1 to 11, just taking one example, it's interesting that in Genesis 2, verse 7, when God is said to take some of the dust of the earth and to breathe on it, it's illuminating to know that, ancient Near Eastern texts like the Enuma Elish describes the creation of the first humans from the clay of the earth and the blood of a demon god. And so from that recognition flows a lot of both literary and theological implications. To me, and I know this is a controversial area where Christians have different views on it, one of the most important literary issues is the issue of genre. What type of writing are we reading? And again, ancient Near Eastern genres are similar, though not necessarily identical with the ones that we're familiar with in our modern context. So as I read, say, Genesis 1 to 11, I say, yeah, this is talking about the past. It is history, but it's giving us a figurative depiction of the past. It's not as if God actually created the first Homo sapien by picking up dust and breathing on it, because God is a spirit. He doesn't have lungs. So it's obviously a figurative depiction of, it's telling us God did it.
Yeah.
He's the one who created everything, including human beings, but it's not telling us how he did it. So yeah, there are many important theological and literary implications. And if I might just say one more thing, sometimes when I talk about this important idea, some people will push back and say, wait a minute, we don't need to know about the ancient Near Eastern background to understand the Bible. It's just me and the Bible, and I don't need your interpretation. And the first thing I would say is, yeah, you don't need to know this in order to understand the most important things for our salvation, but to understand some of the details, important ideas, you have to remember that it wasn't written to you. As a matter of fact, you can't even read it unless you learn Hebrew. And most readers read in a good Spanish or English translation. But what they should realize, as somebody, I'm a senior translator for the New Living Translation. I've been a consultant to a lot of different translations. And the reason why it takes years for us to produce a translation is because we have to make hundreds and even thousands of interpretive decisions as we're translating it. But that shouldn't discourage people, because, as I said, the most important teaching of Scripture is clear to everybody.
Yeah, I get a lot of that because, and since, as I read through the literature, which is a lot, I mean, you guys put a lot of literature there. It's very difficult to keep up with the articles, monographs, books, whatever. It's very difficult to keep up with that. But as I read, I keep coming across this pattern about Genesis 1 through 11, the famous primeval history, which you also talk about in your book, How to Read Genesis, published with IBP. So this is more of a personal question, Dr. Longman. What's the primeval history? Why take a lot of effort from you guys to explain what are the purpose of those stories? What are even there in the first 11 chapters in Genesis?
Yeah, if you'll notice, Genesis 1 to 11 starts at creation and takes us all the way up to the time of Abraham. It's actually the backstory to the Abraham story. It's basically telling us why God calls Abraham and tells him to go to the land that he will show him, which turns out to be Canaan, and then gives him promises. In other words, what Genesis 1 to 11 is telling us are important matters like God created everything.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of the story of human beings who are made in his image, they are morally innocent, but because of our rebellion, we're sinners. And rather than giving up on us, the stories in Genesis 4 and following shows how God keeps pursuing us.
Yeah.
And we keep sinning, whether it's Cain and Abel, the flood story, the Tower of Babel. God keeps judging sin, but he also gives tokens of grace along the
Yep.
way. So I guess my point is that Genesis 1 to 11 is particularly difficult because it's covering a long period of time. It's also got a worldwide perspective. I mean, you get 11 chapters from creation to Abraham, and then you come to Abraham, and it goes from, I think, Genesis 12 to Genesis 25. You get even more chapters on this one guy who's already 75 when the story starts. So I just finished the manuscript, by the way, I'm doing 4 books for Lexham called Navigating Tough Texts of the Old Testament.
Sit.
Murray Harris did Navigating Tough Texts of the New Testament. But
Yeah.
the first volume's on the Torah, and I spent a lot of time in Genesis 1 to 11 because they're some of the more difficult texts for us to understand. We get the big picture. The big picture
Yeah.
is actually easy to understand. Again, we're sinners. We need a savior.
Yeah.
Judges sin, and then it provides, as I say, the backstory to the Abraham story, which itself is the backstory to the Exodus story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Definitely.
So, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why there are a lot of discussions about it. And then, of course, when it comes to Genesis 1 to 11, there are issues that arise in the light of modern science as well. That is important to keep in mind and know about and not dismiss. Because, God speaks to us through his word, but he also speaks to us through nature, and science studies nature. And when the two are interpreting nature and scripture correctly, they'll never conflict. So we shouldn't be afraid of science.
No.
And,
No.
and science, and when it comes to a really well evidenced theory, we need to take that into account. Just take one that some of our listeners might not agree with, but there are like 14 different lines of evidence, that the scientific lines of evidence that the universe is like 14.3 billion years old.
Yeah.
And if you read the Old Testament, and you understand that it's a figurative depiction of history, and you understand that genealogies function differently in the ancient Near East than they do in our modern period of time, then you realize that the Bible is not teaching that the world is only a few thousand years old. So, those are some thoughts, Marv.
No, I agree. And this is, I'm going to throw out another one here as well. I've been reading also that much of what we can find in Genesis 1 through 11 has basically Mesopotamian correspondence. Like, what would you say to that? Is that so, or are we overstating the case, or where do we have there?
I might put it a little bit more broadly, but
Okay.
Basically what you're saying is that there's a lot of ancient Near Eastern background to what we read in Genesis 1 to 11. And I think there might be different reasons for different connections between the ancient Near Eastern materials and Genesis 1 to 11. But yes, and what I mean is some of the ideas are also found in, say, Canaanite literature, but it's not as if they're borrowing it. It's more like they are utilizing it to actually make the case that Baal and the other gods of the ancient Near East are not true gods. Marduk did not create everything. Baal did not create everything. Yahweh created everything.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. I mean, basically, you're right. There's a lot of comparative issues. At Yale, I did my PhD in ancient Mesopotamian literature and compared it to the Bible. Oops. Okay.
It happens again. So
you froze for a minute there.
yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that's the big message. Like, it's not about Marduk. It's not about Baal. The biblical author, they are using polemics. Can we say that word?
Yeah.
And they are ascribing to the God of Israel, who is the real God of gods, the King of the gods. Right.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's a theological message right there. As Heiser would like to put it, that it was a dig. It was a poke in the eye.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and Michael certainly did a lot of good work in this area, bringing out.
Yeah. It's so sad that he left us, but thank Lord. I mean, thank to the Lord that we still got you guys. I mean, we need to take advantage of you while you're still alive and doing a lot of work. I mean, I understand you are professor emeritus, right?
That's right.
So, I would like to multiply myself and talk with many of you at the same time, but that's not possible. But we need to take advantage of the time that we got now and really be productive about it. So, Dr. Longman, let's thank you for your answer to that question. Let's go with the second question right now here, and I like this one, to be honest, because I've been asked when I'm teaching some classes at church. There are some questions that I mean, I understand, and I just acknowledge this right up front that you need to really understand the basics to talk about it. And this is a topic. The question goes like this: what is the documentary hypothesis, and how does this relate to the book of Genesis?
Sure. So the classic documentary hypothesis that goes back to the late 18th century, but really reach a culminating point with a man named Julius Wellhausen in the 1880s.
Yeah,
is the idea that Genesis, well, let's talk about the Torah as a whole, is really a result of the bringing together of four originally independent sources that are described as J, the Yahwist, E, the Elohist, D, the Deuteronomist, and P, the priestly source.
Yeah.
And the classic theory is that J is from the 10th century, around the time of Solomon, and E is from about 100 years later, and D is from the time of Josiah, because Deuteronomy asks for the centralization of worship, and then P is exilic or post-exilic. Now that's the classic idea that over time these four sources were woven together by editors or redactors to produce the Torah as we know it. And the reason why scholars who advocate for the documentary hypothesis go that direction, because they see tensions and even contradictions within text. One classic example is in Genesis 37, where Joseph has come up to see his brothers, and they want to get rid of him, and they say, "Oh, look, it's the Ishmaelites are coming down the road. Let's sell them to the Ishmaelites." And then it says, sold them to the Midianites, and then the Ishmaelites took them. So you have this, the idea is one source had the Ishmaelites taking them to Egypt, another one had Midianites. Or, of course, you have another classic argument in that you have two creation accounts, one in Genesis 1, one in Genesis 2. And the one in Genesis 1 seems like it's written by somebody with a priestly mindset. And Genesis 2 is more like a well-told story. So that seems more like J to people. So those are the kind of argument. Now, that's the classic documentary hypothesis, and there are hundreds of variations on this. And right now, the situation is that you have, mostly in America, advocates of what's called the neo-documentary hypothesis, which, it is different in that, for one thing, some advocates of it don't see the redactors as actively involved in it and so forth. So it is a different kind of approach. And then the Europeans take what is more aptly described as a supplementary approach. Rather than different sources come together, you have a basic text which is supplemented by other people over time. Now, my own view is
tell us your own view.
It's wrong to say that Moses wrote everything in the Pentateuch. I mean, there are just too many things.
Last word.
Like Deuteronomy 34. He didn't write the account of his own death. There are a lot of other indications. So on the one hand, I am not going to argue for Moses writing all the Pentateuch. I'm not going to argue that, it's too speculative to even, except in the obvious cases like Deuteronomy 30.
It is indeed,
on the other hand, I don't find the documentary hypothesis particularly persuasive. And so while I acknowledge that the Torah came to its final form probably in the post-exilic period, I think it does go back to Moses in the 2nd century. I mean, that Moses did write things down, and it goes back to him, but I don't, as I say, find the documentary hypothesis persuasive. And so in most of my work, I put my emphasis on understanding the final form of the text, because that's what's scripture to us. It's not as if what Moses wrote, as opposed to post-Mosaic editions like Deuteronomy 34, they're all scripture to us. And so that's the way I basically approach that question, Marv. And I get
Yeah,
people criticizing me on both sides, you know. But
Heiser used to he used to call himself a supplementarian.
yeah, yeah,
He didn't buy the he didn't buy the whole documentary hypothesis because one of the reasons he said it was tautological, like it was circular reasoning. That's how he labels it. Uh, Me as a layman, I mean, I read through the literature, non-P, just the P um, layer, the Eloistic layer, and Joistic layer, and all of that. Me as a layman, I'm reasoning with the theory. How do they, how do they, even do they know about this stuff? How they, and I understand it's a hypothesis, right? You
yeah,
are espousing a theory, how this came about. I, they also mention about, I was reading Joel Baden's, the renewal of the documentary hypothesis book, and one of the most common arguments they bring up is the doublets
right,
in the stories.
yeah,
That's and I go like, okay, that's you got a point there, but what about the other? And that's where I kind of like stop myself and think, okay, let's consider this, but um, I don't buy the whole thing. So I'm just kind of
right.
in the middle road to say it like that.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah,
Baden, I quote, I'm writing a book now called The Old Testament as History because I recently wrote The Old Testament as Literature. But
yeah,
I'll have a chapter. I'll have a chapter on this issue. But I'm going to quote Baden, who says, "You can't read Genesis as a coherent story." And I'm going,
exactly. Yeah.
yes, you can. Yes, you can. And I actually just 2 days ago, if I can share another.
Yes, please.
Uh, so when I read that, I had just finished an article that just came out. I just got my copy yesterday in
Oh
the
yeah, and you post on Facebook something about it, right?
Cambridge
Yeah.
Companion Biblical Narrative, and I did the chapter on Genesis. And
Yeah.
so it's like, yeah, it's coherent. And then if you think about it, you can see that Genesis 1 and 2 are not in conflict with each other. Uh, you just have to realize that, for instance, neither one of them are interested in giving us how God did it, as if the
Yeah.
sequence is the right one, the one that God had to use. Or, the Midianites are a subcategory of Ishmaelites. It's kind of like, I live in the state of Virginia, right next to Washington, D.C. So it would be appropriate for someone to say about me, hey, he's an American. Oh,
Yeah.
that Virginian, it's
Yeah.
kind of but that kind of what is called harmonization is frowned on by people like Baden. But I think it's perfectly legitimate to do that kind of harmonization.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's move on, Dr. Lemon. The third question, it's something. This is something that I'm asked about this question like literally most of the time because it has to do with, the typical uh what's the word, the dichotomy, right? Myth versus
Mm.
history.
Yeah.
Okay, and let me add to that, history, not the way the ancient
Mm.
understood it, but with the whole baggage and impositions and assumptions, modern assumptions that we bring to the table on that specific term.
Yeah.
And we just want to go, is it history? Yes or no? Is it history? Yes or no? So let me read the question to you. Many critics, um, okay, I didn't show it right here. Many critics take the accounts in Genesis as pure myth. or oh, this is fiction, nothing to see, keep moving, citizens. uh, therefore, unreliable, right?
Yeah.
So, Dr. Lemon, you as an Old Testament scholar and trained in ancient Near East stuff, how would you address such criticism?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say there. First of all, it's often pitched myth or history. Um, and the first comment I'll make is it kind of depends on how you define myth.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
because if myth means to you just made up story that
Made
is
up. Yeah.
true, yeah, no, it's not that myth. But myth is most often in scholarly circles understood to mean foundational stories,
Yeah.
stories that are told in order to help us understand who we are, who God is. Um, like I would say the description of that we get in Genesis 2:7, which I referred to earlier, where God's breathing on dust. It's helping us understand that we're part of creation. We're,
Yeah.
we're dust, but we also have a special relationship with God that's dignified, as opposed to the Babylonians that talk about humans being created from the clay of the earth and the blood of a demon god.
Slaves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so, um, and then even the fiction history is um, is a false dichotomy in some ways. In other words,
Hmm.
all history, even modern history, involves selection. It involves you don't you can't there's no such thing as an objective history, because
I agree.
all history involves not only selection, and you only choose as a historian to put in what you think is important, but that is already interpretive.
Yeah.
And then of course you're writing in a way that interprets the events, especially in the Bible. So my friend Phil Long wrote a great book called The Art of Biblical History that I recommend
Mm.
everybody. And then Phil and Ian Proven and I wrote a history of Israel together,
Yes.
where we incorporate some of these ideas. So, is Genesis 1 to 11 historical? Yeah, I think it's talking about things that happened in the past. God did create everything. That's the claim that's being made.
Theological truth. Yeah.
But it's not making the claim that God, you know, did it in 6 literal days and
Yeah.
7, because you could see, yeah. So it's an important question, and one that doesn't admit of a easy yes or no answer.
No, I know, and I appreciate your effort because this if we go a little bit on the New Testament side, the same thing happens with, for example, the life of Jesus.
Hmm.
Um, uh, there are some I don't like labels, but there are some I don't know how to call it, but there are some scholars, historical Jesus scholars, who are um, I don't know if I should say this, but they are a little bit of extremists. They take it too far, way too far, when say that Jesus didn't exist and he wasn't a historical Jesus.
Right.
And then you have an atheist. He's an atheist and an agnostic man like Bob Ehrman, who has no problem in being intellectually honest and say, yeah, the guy existed. I mean, we got pretty much abundance info and evidence that the guy did exist and he walked on the earth. So that's something that I see a lot with Genesis as well.
Yeah.
And this is not. I mean, Dr. Lama doesn't have the last word on this, but scholars over the years continue to face such a question, and that's why I sympathize with your last comment that this is not an easy question um, to talk about this stuff. Many people, layman people like me, we want to what's the word? We want to turn this kind of a questions, the complex questions, in a yes or no answer, and most of the time it doesn't work that way. You
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
you need
Yeah.
to think through these things. It takes work to
It does.
say
It
the
does.
least.
Yeah. And nuance, as
And
they say.
nuance. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for nuancing my comment. So yeah, that's the thing. I remember, and I apologize, Dr. Lemon, but I keep bringing my mic into the conversation. But I'm so very influenced by his work. Uh, like I literally had nothing to do with. I didn't know biblical studies world even existed. It was because of him. So
Yeah.
um, the reason why I mentioned this to you is because he did on his podcast. He did a Exodus series, and the same thing was brought up to the whole Exodus. Did the Exodus really happen? Yes or no? And he would go like, modern people is artificially um, coming with arguments. The ancient people, they even didn't have the time for that kind of way with the way we think about this stuff. And they would bring up the concept of theologized history.
Yeah.
um, and it is history, but it's being narrated
Mm.
or told it with a theological spin on it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Adjudicating God, who is behind of all this.
Right.
So that's the thing. It's not an easy thing. Just keep that in mind. So let's move on to the fourth question, Dr. Lemon. And let's see here. We're doing pretty good with the time, I think. Yeah. Okay. So, which are those parallels between the accounts of Genesis and the surrounding ancient Near East cultures? And what does that entail for us as modern readers?
Mm. Well, I mean, there are a number that we could choose, and we already talked
Yeah.
extensively about the Genesis 2:7 parallel. Um, and maybe I'll go next to the flood story,
Yeah.
where you have, of course, the biblical flood story, which I think most of the listeners will be familiar with.
Yeah.
But then you move to ancient Near Eastern, particularly Mesopotamian literature, and there are references to a flood that goes back to the third millennium in Sumerian, but the most well-known
Yeah.
stories are from the Gilgamesh epic and from Atrahasis. Uh,
Yeah.
and the Gilgamesh epic story really sounds a lot like the biblical account in that a god named Enlil decides to destroy humanity, and
Because he wants to sleep.
yeah, he wants to sleep. They're making too much noise. They're making too much, and
Yeah.
that's the difference. There are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences too. And
Yeah.
then, and so, but another god tells a guy named Utnapishtim to build an ark, and he brings animals on, and then the flood comes, and then later when the waters are receding, he sends out 3 birds, and after the ark settles, he opens up the ark and he offers sacrifices to the gods. So a lot of similarities, and but differences, and the main differences are accounted for by the fact that the Babylonians worshipped a number of different gods who didn't all agree with each other,
Yeah.
and the biblical text, of course, is focused on Yahweh and or Elohim, God, and so what are we to make of this? And again, using my understanding of Genesis 1 to 11 as a figurative depiction of history, I would argue, yeah, there was a massive flood, not a worldwide flood, but a massive flood, which is described as a worldwide flood using hyperbole in order to make theological points. But again, that's a good example of ancient Near Eastern connections. And then, the Tower of Babel story, clearly the tower, if you read it in the context of the ancient Near East, is describing an ancient ziggurat or a stepped pyramid, like we're familiar with from Mesopotamia. And so, yeah, there are lots of connections there. So, and Michael Heiser's work is good on bringing out a lot of them. I try to do that in my Genesis commentary, especially.
You do. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Story of God commentary series actually has, each section is treated under 3 topics. One is, let's see, it's about the background of the text. And in that first part, I'd bring out any ancient Near Eastern connections that are in the text. Then you explain the text, and then you live the text. And that's looking at that text from a New Testament perspective and asking, well, what does this ancient text have to tell me about Christ and about how to live my life today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of what do you call it? I understand, and I have heard many critics, going like, okay, we got these parallels, these similarities, so that's why the Israelites were dumb enough to just copy paste.
Yeah.
Like literally, come on, they're part of the ancient Near East culture. I mean, that's their milieu. They're sharing many concepts, worldviews. I understand their theology is in competition. That's obvious, right from the text itself. But to go out and say no, they were just copying because they weren't smart enough to come up with their own text or whatever. I think that's a little bit of a. I was having a conversation with one person in church who also likes this stuff about you guys' scholarship and biblical studies and whatnot. He's a bookish person, just like you and me. and he was saying to me, I this feels like because on his mom's side is Jewish, so he has some Jewish blood going on there. And he said to me, this feels sometimes when I listen to this kind of arguments, this feels a little bit of an anti-Semitism to me. uh and when he said that to me, that I was left like thinking about that, because he's taking the Israelites not very seriously, like just saying that they were not able to come up with their own views, idiosyncratically way, in a very idiosyncratic way, but they have to copy paste everything in the Bible is just copy paste.
Yeah.
I understand they are interacting with the other cultures, and sometimes poking fun of them.
Yeah. Right.
Just go read Elijah with the Princess Belle. Oh, Belle is sleepy. So yeah, that we got this kind of things going on in the text. This is a very personal question as well, Dr. Lemon. Let's take for example uh, the famous, the uh, forever controversial passage such as Genesis 6:1 to 1 through 4, the angels, the sons of God, and everything. I mean, what's your view on this? Did that really happen? It's
Um,
just what's going on there?
well, I mean, the first thing I always say when I talk about that text,
Okay.
and to be honest, I have to say, I know Michael talked about this a lot, but it's been a while since I read him. But my own view is the first thing we need to say is uh, we can't be dogmatic about the details of the text. I mean,
Yeah.
what is clear is that somebody is having relationships with a group that they shouldn't be having relationships with, and it's an example of sin.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think that Jewish literature picks up on the idea, and the biblical terminology supports the idea that the sons of God are angels and the daughters of men are human women, which helps explain why their progeny are, unusual, shall we say. Uh,
Yeah.
so like the Book of Jubilees, even Jude in verse 6 talks about angels who left
Yeah.
their. So I think the best thinking about it is that. Now the next question, what did that look like in terms of its historical background? Because again, I think it's a figurative
Yeah.
depiction of a historical event. I'm not prepared at this moment to commit myself, to be honest. I have to think about it
Yeah.
a little bit more. But but yeah, I do write about. That's one, of course, one of the controversial texts I write about in my forthcoming book, and I probably have more detail there. And that
Yeah.
book I think is going to come out like in a year from now. It's done. It just takes about a year for it to come out.
So yeah, people, we need to be on the lookout for that book to come out and go get it. Yeah, definitely. So thank you for that. What I can say, Dr. Lemon, on that question is that at least uh, for some Jews at the time of Jesus, the Second Temple period, for some Jews, that was what really happened. We
Yeah.
got divine beings,
Yeah.
and you can see that parallel in the Greek mythology.
Right.
So I would go like, yeah, for some that's the case, but
Yeah.
not for some others. I mean, Philo doesn't take that view, if I'm not mistaken. So uh, I think there are views in competition even within Judaism itself, right?
Yeah. Right.
So,
Yeah. Sure. Right.
which is a human thing. So there you go.
Yeah.
We're not always in agreement on everything. Yeah. I mean that the day that we human beings come to an agreement with on everything, like to the last thing, that would be the end of the world, most
Yeah.
likely. Yeah.
Heaven. We'll be in heaven.
We'll be human, yeah. We'll be human. So, question number 5, Dr. Lohman, in your book you talk about, and this is something more of a for Christians, because you
Yeah.
said in your book as a Christians how we should read this, and you said you talk about the Christological difference
Yeah.
when reading the book of Genesis. So please elaborate on that. What exactly do you want to come across
Yeah.
with that statement?
So, so basically, I think the Bible is one organic whole. That God is the ultimate author, even though it comes from a lot of different authors and different time
Yeah.
periods. So, and then as I read Luke 24, when Jesus is walking with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and he says all the scriptures talked about him, the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, or the law and the prophets. what Jesus is telling us is that the whole Old Testament anticipated him. So in result, I first of all say it's really, really important to read the Old Testament twice as a Christian.
Yeah.
Once you read it and you block out the whole New Testament story and you ask, how did the original audience understand this? And then ask the second question. Well, now in the light of the fuller revelation of the New Testament, how do I understand it? So I think it's really important to keep those two separate. Otherwise, we're going to miss some important teaching. We don't want to impose the New Testament on the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Just to give one example, Genesis 3:1, talking about the serpent, Christians often go almost immediately to that's the devil.
That's Satan.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think that's the right answer. But if you ask the question, what did the original audience during the Old Testament time period understand? They would have understood, and John Walton, cites some examples of this, that a walking serpent was a symbolic representation of evil and a personal evil. So, but to import back into Genesis 3:1 a full-blown, understanding of Satan wouldn't respect how the original audience would have understood that text.
Yeah. Now, you agree that Christ was understood, at least by the earliest followers. I mean, the guys who wrote the Gospels, they are drawing a lot from the Old Testament to present Jesus in whatever, in whatever portrayal of the Gospels, be it Mark, Luke, Matthew, John, whatever.
Yeah.
So they are drawing a lot on the New Testament. Dr. Longman, can you give me just 30 seconds? I'm having some call here just to answer very quick. Just bear with me.
Sure.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Longman.
Yeah, no problem.
So, as I was saying, so a lot of these people, they are drawing a lot from the Old Testament in terms of prophecies.
Yeah.
They're using the Psalms. Mm-hmm. They are using, let's say, Isaiah, Emmanuel among us. So they're drawing heavily from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And when you say the Christological reference, for example, to give you another example, the famous Proto-Evangelium, they call it, I think, the seed of the woman crushing the seed of the serpent.
Yeah.
And we Christians, we have no issues. We know who's the seed of the woman. It's Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, right.
But can we say that that's a Christian reading of the text, but not a Jewish, not entirely Jewish? What I mean is that not all Jewish people may have been in agreement with that.
Right.
What would you say to that?
I say that's right. That and by the way, we need to again understand a little bit why our Jewish friends don't read it that way, because as I said, Jesus actually coming helps people of Christian faith see how it's a fulfillment of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But you have to have faith in Christ See that. And sometimes, here's a good example of not importing the New Testament back to the Old Testament, speaking of Isaiah 7:14.
Yeah.
It's about the Alma is the Hebrew word, having a child. And if you read the context, it says, and before that child is old enough to tell the difference between wrong and right, those two kings up in the north who are bothering you will be gone. So
Yeah.
I'm there, and so it's talking about some contemporary thing that's then later being applied to Jesus. And I do think there are good reasons within the context to think that this Emmanuel prophecy has later fulfillments, but you could see, but we have to. So, for instance, if somebody wants to go up and share the gospel with a Jewish person,
Yeah.
you throw Isaiah 7:14 at them, they'll go to their rabbi, and the rabbi will say, "Hey, look at this. This was fulfilled, in the next few years."
Had nothing to do with Jesus. So
Right.
keep moving. Yeah. Oh my goodness. But as I see it, those were the kind of licenses they have back in the day. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
They're looking back to their old Hebrew scriptures,
Oh, yeah.
and they're making all kind of connections.
Yeah.
The Psalm 22, for example, it's Jesus. Hey, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the writer is just taking that psalm and applying it to Jesus itself. So that's what they're doing, and that's the Christological reference that you mentioned in your book right there. Paul is another guy who is doing a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this is a very quick question. Is it true that the book of Isaiah it's the most quoted book that you can find in the literature, the Second Temple literature, and Paul and some other guys? Isaiah is being quoted a lot.
Yeah.
Like literally.
Yeah.
Like literally a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. It's very interesting that I mean, we got the great book of Isaiah, and the Dead Sea Scroll is almost, I think it's one of the best preserved documents from that literature.
Yeah, you're right. I think there are actually 2 copies of it that are pretty good.
We got 2 copies? Okay. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I've actually seen them in Jerusalem and also seen facsimiles of them.
It's a beautiful piece of literature. I mean, it's a relic. It's awesome. Okay, Dr. Lemon, last but not least, this is final question here in today's episode with you. Again, I just want to thank you for your time and taking our questions. So it goes like this. To conclude, what books do you recommend to go deeper in the study of the book of Genesis in its ancient Near East context?
Sure. I, of course, start with my Genesis commentary.
Yeah, let's gonna plug that.
But also, John Walton has written a commentary on Genesis. Plus, there's a work called the Zondervan Illustrated Bible commentary on the Old Testament. And John also did Genesis in there. So those would be a couple of the places I would go. There's also if you want to actually read the texts themselves, there's a pretty accessible collection of ancient Near Eastern texts by Christopher Hayes, from Fuller Seminary, Richard Hayes, the son. It's called Hidden Riches. So those are a few things that I would recommend.
Okay, thank you for that. So with that, we got all the questions answered today. Dr. Lemon, I don't know if you can say our final words and comments for the audience before we can come to a conclusion today?
Sure. It's just, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be with you, and thank you for listening in, and God bless you in your lives and in your study of the Bible.
Well, I appreciate your time and thank you. Remember, this is a platform for you as a scholar. Whenever we can have you back, we really looking forward to that. For our audience, remember we got the other episodes coming on onto the show. We will have on March the one and only John Jane Collins talking about his Apocalyptic Imagination, which is a book that was recently translated into Spanish, and we need to talk about that. And yeah, so Dr. Collins is getting ready to come and take your questions, our questions, and go deeper on this very important topic. With that in mind, with Dr. Tremper right here, I say bye now and take care.